Sure, sure. And thanks again, Rick, for having me on. I'm so
Of course.
excited to talk with you today. Um, Something that I've been coming to over the past couple months is like, what does all of my work fall under?
Hmm.
And really, I can say that it's all about identity. So the individual work that I do, I coach folks who need help embracing their inner brilliance. And so we do a lot of self care and boundaries work, which is all about identity. I do a lot of community work and public narratives, mapping ecosystems, and that's all about who are we as a community and how do we heal together and tell the truth about what has happened, what is happening, and what we want to happen. And then on the institutional side, I'm really looking at organizational identity, right? Like what's the core of who we are and how do we practice what we preach? So I'm typically working with organizations who have some kind of anti-racism, anti-oppression, DEI commitment, and they want to figure out how do we make this live in our culture such that it becomes the lens through which we see and do everything. So yeah, all my work is identity work. I think the latest community offering that I have that's out in the world is my podcast called Take Nothing When I Die. And it is about amplifying the wisdom of people who've managed multiple careers in one lifetime. So these folks identify as dabblers, slash careerists,
Hmm.
jack of all trades, Jill of all trades. And it's been really interesting to have those folks on the show. It's also an opportunity for me to explore what does it mean to be a living ancestor. And I
Hmm.
came to that in thinking like all if I'm living out my purpose, like it doesn't fit within the 9 to 5 box, which means I'm a
Right.
dabbler, which means I'm doing coaching and community and org stuff. So kind of bringing it full circle, it all falls under identity.
That's awesome. And that I like that identity, bringing it all together. I think so many people get into situations where those pursuits, rather than just putting them within context, they try and treat them all as business opportunities or things they should be doing. So I love that way of just contextualizing it. To your point about speaking the truth, I just want to highlight here that Stephanie and I have had this scheduled for a while. We've been pushing it back because obviously of what's happening in our world right now. And I want to be explicit that I'm not trying to put any additional emotional labor on Stephanie, not asking her to do any work. We're just here to have a conversation and kind of figure out how do we continue to do the work from here. And Stephanie, I really appreciate you being here and being present and just taking the time and energy to do this. I know it's a difficult time. So um, just kind of to start off, Stephanie, former resident of Portland, has a good feel for what the Portland startup community is like and relocated to Atlanta. Can you talk to us a little bit about like what was attractive about Atlanta, what drew you to the community, and what you've discovered as you've been a resident there?
Sure, sure. Yeah. So my partner and I, we spent about 3 years in Portland, and I think we dug as deep as we possibly could in community and with existing community and building community and hoping to strengthen and amplify community. And where we got to was that it was really lonely. We were away from family, right? So even the folks who stepped up and showed up, we were like, this is great. And what else? Like, we need
Yep.
something more, especially as we think about like, what would it be like to raise a family here or have a house here or like really get rooted here? And so as we were considering, we're like, where is a place that one, we have a better shot at getting a house, right? If we're talking about
Yeah.
pricing, where will we be closer to family like if we are going to start having kids, and then like climate, political climate, geographic climate, um, demographics climate. We're like,
Yeah.
where can we be more comfortable and be at home and be at peace or more at peace? And so we were looking closer. We both are from the Midwest. So we're like, we know it's somewhere on this side of the country, but we weren't really sure where. And after a couple visits, we were like, all right, I think this might be home base, knowing that I don't think any place is perfect. But we were like, this is a place that we can get really rooted in terms of our culture, our people, communities, and things like that. So Atlanta was attractive for all those reasons. When people ask now, they're kind of like, well, what made you pick Atlanta? I'm like, how much time do you have? All right, like I can tell you about the sun that's
Yeah.
out way more. Although it does rain harder here. Like when it rains, it's not that Portland rain, like
Hmm.
drip drip. It's like storm. It's a southern storm.
Hmm.
So weather, pricing, like it's much cheaper to live here, even though that's changing too.
Hmm.
Way more Black folks. I mean, like I am in a bubble. Like sometimes I actually don't see white people, which is
Yeah.
really interesting. And it's also, I think about like the energetic shift, right? Like where in Portland it feels like I'm not supposed to be there. Like
Yeah.
that's like that's my general when I'm walking around and I'm on the street or I'm somewhere, it's like, why are you here? There's like a question. And I don't
Hmm.
feel that way in Atlanta. So again, Atlanta's not perfect. There's lots to work on here, but as we've moved, we've seen the ways that folks here in at least in the entrepreneurship and startup communities seem to be much more connected. They're
Hmm.
connecting the dots in a lot of different ways. So when Rick reached out, I was like, yeah, what are some of the ways that the entrepreneurship community feels different here? For me, it's like on a couple of levels. One, the informal networks here are pretty strong, right? So even before COVID, you have people who are connected, who are sharing resources. Max reminded me, like, there are folks sharing houses, like there's communal housing, sharing accountants and things like that. And I like the there's a metaphor about, you know, the birds flocking, where
Hmm.
the bird in the front, when the bird in front gets tired, you go to the back and you kind of catch with the wind, like the flock takes you with them. And I see that a lot here when people are breaking up with their co-founders and the deal didn't go through, and there's ways that these people just like spring up. Hey, you want to work with me on this? Hey, I can provide this for you. So a lot of the informal networks feel much more connected. I would also say that the actual entities that are providing some of the support and services for entrepreneurs is also much more connected. In Portland, it feels like sometimes everyone's not talking, and so we're
Yep.
overlapping and kind of doing the same things. And not saying that that never happens here, but it feels clear like government has their lane and they support some of the other pieces, and then you've got VCs have their lane and they support. So it's like there's a roadmap. When we got
Hmm.
here, where it was like, okay, we go here for this, we talk to this person for this, we talk to this person for this, and if this wasn't the lane, I know where to go. So
Yep.
there's the dots are more connected. And I think the other thing is that just as a structural entity, even people outside of the entrepreneurship sphere are still plugged in. I think
Hmm.
that's a function of Atlanta's really diverse industries. Like you got politics, you got like film and TV here. So it's all of these different angles of like, okay, we could talk about specifics in terms of technical assistance, but we could also talk about like, what would it mean for us to be lobbying and advocate and look at legislation? What does it mean? Like Tyler Perry showing up at stuff, and you got like rappers, right? So it's a function of who's
Yeah.
here and what industries are here that I think feels pretty different from Portland.
Well, and I felt, I've been watching Atlanta for a while, just as an example. I mean, even way back when to like Peachtree Software days, which was one of those old installed software accounting programs from back in the day. Um, that there's a certain, I don't know how to describe it, but like rigor to the community that seems to be there's documentation about like who's doing what, and there's centralized resources about how to get involved or who you should be talking to or what organizations, and that doesn't seem to be something that Portland or Oregon has ever done a terribly good job with. They seem to be stuck in the, I refer to it as kind of that small town stance of, well, if one person's doing it, then it's probably good. Like,
Right.
there's not that support that you were describing of like multiple voices coming together to really build the community in an effective way.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think another thing too, when we think about the culture that exists here,
Mhm.
people are building businesses in other places. They're in the Bay, they're on the West Coast, but then it's like, what are the rooted parts that I need to like stay here?
Mhm.
This year, or this year and last year, you have some big names that have moved here. Tristan Walker moved
Yep.
here. Sheena Allen, like all these folks who are like, what is the cultural pull? And those were both informal networks, and then formal networks. You got Google saying, hey, we're going to name so and so, hey, we want you to come. WeWork's asking folks to do stuff too. So yeah, it's like the undercurrent puts pressure on the agencies for them to get their stuff together. And I think
Mhm.
they're still fumbling in some ways. I know one major way that they haven't connected the dots for folks is one that happened recently with Invest Atlanta had a fund for entrepreneurs and for creatives, but the requirements said you had to be in Fulton County. And
Mm.
so that like we have to connect the structural dots. Like if gentrification is happening and the city is so much more expensive to live in Atlanta than in the outside suburbs, a lot of our entrepreneurs are moving out there and now they're not
Okay.
eligible for what Invest Atlanta has put aside. So
Mhm.
I think that's one piece. Where I've seen that work well is when they can step out of the way. And I think that's the other piece that you're talking about, like
Yep.
companies who are like, oh no, we'll administer and we know what to do. It's like there are regional micro funds that are like, hey, community, you tell us what to do and we'll do it. And we
Mm.
hand it all the way over to you instead of trying to play the middle person or, exerting power in a weird way. It's like,
Yep.
can we do the thing that we said we were going to do? That's what people are looking for. That's it. Give us the write the check,
Right.
get out of the way. That's what they ask for, and I think that happens more and more here.
Yeah. Wait, people actually do stuff. They don't just talk about it constantly.
Yeah, it's a
Weird.
novel idea.
What a
It's a
weird
novel concept.
concept.
I mean, we can meet about meeting and talk about talking about getting ready to get ready to
Hmm.
prepare.
Yeah.
And here I see less of that, right? It's like
Yeah.
straight, you got to meet, but also people are like, okay, in the meeting, what do you need? Who is it? What do I need to do? And it gets
Hmm.
done, which
Yeah.
that window of like time from when you meet someone till when they actually do the thing they say they're going to do is so much smaller.
Mm, yeah. And in terms of just out of curiosity, the impact of the pandemic on the community, like what are you seeing there from a perspective at Atlanta?
Yeah, so I think because the informal networks are strong and
Hmm.
they're nimble, people are able to mobilize and mobilize pretty quickly. So a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of founders were like, wow, I need to pivot really, really quickly. And not
Hmm.
only were there technical resources to match that, and then you got the slew of funds and things like that, but people were really stepping up and helping each other out. And I've seen that like with some really close friends. I've seen programs that are similar to Pi, boot camps, accelerators,
Yep.
pressing a pause on the in-person stuff. But then someone says, you know what, I want to coach this group of people who aren't done with the cohort. So you got people stepping up and saying, hey, I'll work with these new founders or these like pre-founders. So I've just seen a really quick mobilization. I've seen when I think about the structural pieces, how does mutual aid help entrepreneurs, which is something I just haven't seen in my mind. That is like it's like organizer, activist, mutual aid
Yep.
is in that category, and never have seen like how does that intersect with entrepreneurship. And I've seen a lot of ways that people and entities have been shifting their structures to accommodate entrepreneurs. The
Mm.
city owns a lot of art galleries for some reason, and they've opened those up for people to have events or to have launches or do stuff like that. Libraries are getting in the game too, like doing technical assistance, like gathering things. Like it just is everyone's kind of pitching in, and
Hmm.
I see that coming from inside the entrepreneurship community and folks who are also outside.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think it comes down to that, we hear so often that the most successful entrepreneurial communities, it's the startups and entrepreneurs who are kind of leading the charge, and then other organizations coming in to support them. And I've always recognized that Atlanta has a way of doing that that's super effective.
Yeah, and I think this is coming to mind too. And I'm gonna say this. I think it's true. Um, I think there's less of a stigma of having a 9 to 5 or a side hustle here. Like,
Hmm.
I think in some ways, my experience of the startup community in Portland was like, it's this or bust, like it's this
Mm.
or else. And I think that's a function of the resourcing. Like, I only have one shot versus like, I don't want to be a serial entrepreneur. It's like, I tried this thing, it didn't work, I'm done. And
Hmm.
I think in Atlanta, because you have the diverse industries where you have a politician slash rapper slash startup founder
Yeah.
slash barber, like you have the ways that people are like, yeah, I have this stream and this stream and also own this thing and I'm trying out all these different ways. I think it really is a function like we have more chances to fail here, which is good for us because then we can look at other streams and it's
Yeah.
not as like, oh, I have to lessen myself to take a 9 to 5. People are like, I'm doing this to pay my bills. And also I do all these other slashes too.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. And that kind of goes back to where we started with just kind of, you focusing around the concept of identity, regardless of what the things are that you're working on. This is the thing that brings them all together. Where I think you're right. In Portland, it's while I feel like people are more well-rounded than maybe communities to the south of us, where it's just be all and end all is working in a tech company. I do agree that you kind of become beholden to this insular community, and that becomes your be all and end all, even if you're well-rounded in terms of hobbies or other pursuits. So that's a really interesting insight. Thank you. Um, Looks like we've got questions rolling in, and I know you and I could chat all day. So let's get into some of the questions that the folks are asking. So the number one right now is, now that you have some distance from Portland, what are three recommendations for what needs to happen here?
And this is in the startup community. I'm
Could be,
guessing Steven's.
yeah,
Hey,
could
Steven.
be Portland. Stephen's the unofficial mayor of Portland, so
Oh,
could
okay.
be
I
could
know
be looking for
people.
political platform stuff. I don't know.
Yo, Steven can make it happen. Okay, three recommendations. I'll just go at the top of my head. I
Yep.
think one is to get closer to action, right? Like, so the meeting about, the talking about, the preparing to prepare, it's like we got to do. And we were talking in the green room about experimenting. Like
Yep.
a lot of this stuff is an experiment. Try it out. You got to take a risk, try it out, get some feedback, and change instead of like talk about, think about, prepare to do. And I
Yep.
think so if Portland can close the gap, and this is for um, agencies that provide resources. This is for, I saw a Tech Town pledge question on there. It's like, get to the thing. We don't
Hmm.
have, there are spaces where we have, where I would say particularly white folks, they get aware and they want to go right to action, but they skip the analysis. We've got a lot of analysis,
Hmm.
right? This is part of a liberatory consciousness framework developed by Dr. Barbara Love, right? So it's like awareness, analysis, action, accountability. I see people stay in awareness or they skip analysis to get to action. We've got so much data, we've got feedback from folks. Do the things that people have asked you to do. And then we got to hold folks accountable. And when we hold folks accountable, that means something has to change. There are consequences based on you didn't make it or you fell short. And we can be honest about that. I think
Yep.
that's the second piece is like, if we're going to get to the thing, learn what transparency actually means. Transparency is not like I tell all my business. It's like, right. Well, this is what happens in like I go to organizations and they're like, well, how do we be transparent? You talk about the things that have happened. We fucked up here. We made a
Hmm.
mistake here. We tried this thing and it didn't work. We're going to try something else, right?
Yep.
And so learn how to communicate and be transparent and be relational in those aspects. That is what it takes. And then I would say third is I think there has to be a mindset shift. I think what I experience and what I know of the Portland some folks in the
Mhm.
entrepreneurship sphere is that they do because it's popular, or because it'll make it on the front page of the paper. What I know about the strength of the startup community there is the people who are underground, the people who don't get recognized, the people who are doing the most work and are having the most impact. They're not doing it to get on a headline. You're not doing this to get on to get on the front page. And I think that's sad that it hasn't happened, right? Like, people should know that this is a place where people feel community, they feel like it's impactful, they feel like it's substantive. But unfortunately, the people who keep making the headlines are folks who are doing the least
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
making the least impact. So I think the mindset shift is like, would I do this if I couldn't get any credit for it? And if being really real with your answer, if your answer is all about public recognition,
Yeah.
you're not doing it for the right reason, and it's probably going to fail.
Yep. Yep. I totally agree. Well, and it's always, I don't know if this analogy plays, but like in my mind, it feels like a very academic environment, like culturally academic, where we want to talk and discuss and argue points, but there's this kind of division of like there are the tenured professors who don't really care because they got tenure and they just want to publish and be famous. And then there's the adjuncts who are all trying to do the work to get tenure, but they don't, they don't get the recognition. And that's kind of what the Portland community feels like to me on a regular basis.
Yes, yes, 100%.
Mhm. Yeah, you saw the next one. It's still up the top. So, speaking of talking versus doing, tech knowledge, or dump it. What should we do there, and why?
Well, okay. There's so much to say about this. The thing is, okay, this is my honest opinion.
Mhm.
The structure of the thing impacts the its outputs, right? So like how we frame a problem impacts how we solve that problem. And I think Techtown has a structure and a framing issue. Fundamentally, its goals, what it's looking for, how it's holding people accountable, and who are wrong, right? And so I think that yeah, that's my thoughts on it. So if it were to change, it would have to fundamentally change. Like, I'm not
Mhm.
talking about like reform, I'm talking about abolish, right? I'm in the abolish camp. It
Yep.
has to be completely dismantled because the very foundation is faulty, which is like it's positioned, I think, as like a white savior, superficial, like think about, talk about, try to do, and no real teeth for accountability and actually doing. So if they're going to have it, different people need to run it. It has to have a clear and different structure, and how it's framing what it's trying to tackle has to change.
Yep.
And so I want to acknowledge there have been the people are putting work in it. I understand
Yeah.
that it's not
Yeah.
all terrible or all great, and it never will be. But what I do know is that when I think about like who are the front faces of it, what have been the we can look at the outcomes. I don't care about the intentions. I want to look
Mhm.
at what impact it's had. And we look at the data, and data of all kinds. There are numbers that show that it's not working.
Mhm.
People are saying it's not working. And I don't know what the outcomes aren't matching where they said they want to be. And I think the intentions need to change too. So it's a structural and a framing issue, which means it needs to be abolished.
Yep. Yep. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think part of that is it was very much like a classic startup issue, which was a bunch of people came up with the concept without talking to any potential end users or customers, and then said, "Here's the thing, and here's what we're doing, and you should like it because we decided that it was the right thing to do." Um, what do you think about grassroots versus top down? Is there the potential for something powered by the people to make it a more effective and to give it more teeth?
I think so if if the top is willing to shift power, right? Like, I think most large scale efforts for change in this country and beyond have been started by grassroots people. And they have had connections or influence to folks who were in power. What it seems like is the folks who are running it, I like, and I know there's like lots of people and there's the board and then there's the people that meet and all the things. It's like, what are the structural things that can change as a result? Not the optics, not the superficial, not the like number two on the list. So I do think I think there are always people doing the work. There are people doing really, really good work in some of those organizations and outside of. But I think the missing link is like, where is the structural power shift going to happen? Someone has to step down or step back or give up. And I think when we talk about power as a zero sum game, like some folks are just not willing to do that. But I think grassroots is the way to go. And it has been. Like, we have examples of small groups of folks who are doing really incredible work. And I think they have some of that, the power, the access to power there.
Yep. Thank you. And this is getting, and feel free to push back on this because this is getting a little bit, I'm always shy about those lines between advice versus your actual business. So this is getting a little close to a business question. So feel free to push it. Where do you see companies going wrong with diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives? Are there any common themes where people usually stumble with this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I'll go. This feels broad, and I'll go broad.
Okay.
I think one is thinking that it's an initiative, right? So if it is a siloed, piecemeal, sprinkle it on top when it's convenient, but then when COVID hits, it's like not one of our priorities. I think that's number one. And number two, I think that we have to get clear about language. And sometimes DEI is a synonym for something. We say urban and we say DEI and they become useless. What I want to know is, like, how are you talking about power in your organization and the impact it's having disproportionately on people? We're going to talk about racism and sexism and transphobia and homophobia and ageism and classism. DEI work is not necessarily always translating into anti-oppression work. So I think that the framework needs to be looked at too. And I think what happens is companies will say, well, we want to be more diverse, which means they want to hire, the translation is, we want to hire entry-level Black and brown people. And again, the structure doesn't shift. I was just on a call, my high school put out like a diversity statement. It was trash. And it was trash. And they had all these like, we have these diversity initiatives and we're gonna, and what they were, they're band-aids on the real issue. And I said on the call, I said, if the culture is poisonous, you showing me more people who look like me who are getting poisoned isn't helpful. I need you to stop being poisonous, stop being toxic. That's what I need. And so I think and I think that goes to the first thing I was saying, like, this is a full scale culture transformation. It is not a one-time thing. It's not bring one person, one Black or brown person in. It's how are you fundamentally transforming your identity and power in your organization? Because the same folks who have uplifted and perpetuated the culture are the same ones making the decisions. Right. And so it's going to be hard to get out of this cycle unless those folks are willing to do something different.
Yep. That makes sense. Thank you. You kind of touched on this, but maybe just to put a finer point on it, how do we help folks understand that, and kind of the way I'll kind of paraphrase this, I think in looking back and realizing these are systems of power that have been built over the last 400 years or more.
Yes.
And doing the work of dismantling and recreating this system is going to take a lot of work over a very long period of time, probably several lifetimes of time for people. How do we help people in the community understand that that type of work requires daily work and is not a fad or a box that you check?
Yeah. I mean, I think you set it up and you said it. It's like to be really urgent about Black Lives Matter and DEI now is a privilege, 100%.
Yeah.
Because as you said, this has been happening for 500 years plus,
Yeah.
right? So my number one advice, like I've been getting calls and emails and, we got to do this now. And I'm like, you know, this has been happening for 500 years.
Yeah.
Why now? And racism isn't going anywhere, so why now? And then they kind of give their justification.
Mhm.
But my advice is to get strategic about what you need to be urgent about. What I hear is people saying, I want to get urgent about doing something. The sentiment is like, I don't want to feel like a bad person. When can I feel comfortable and like a good person again? And I can't tell you when that's going to happen. So I don't have any advice for you there, but I think that what we have to realize is, what should we get urgent about? Can we get urgent about expediting our own education? Can we get urgent about radicalizing our friends and family? Can we get urgent about, putting pressure on leadership, not necessarily trying to go make a statement and get to the front of the protest and like we haven't done our work. And I think what's been instructive here is to look at what has happened before. There have been people that have come before me, that have come before us. I think about like a Ruth and a Angela. Like people are like abolition now, and she's like, I've been talking about this since the 60s.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there's got to be some. On my end, I have to have some patience for folks who are just coming into this awareness, and for folks who are just coming into awareness, they need to realize the history and context and what we're up against.
Yeah.
This is a day-to-day battle, and it's a marathon. It's not a one-time thing. It's not like, okay, Black Lives Matter for the next 2 weeks and then I'm done with
Right.
my signs. This is a journey. And I think understanding that and having that mindset is something that helps. And I'm just telling people, get strategically urgent. It might not be about your organization writing a statement. It might be something else.
Mm. That's great. Thank you. Um, okay, I am 1 year into my tech career. I've been vocal about my stance on DEI. My company is listening. Do you have examples of actionable things that we or me can do to hold each other and our company more accountable for doing work?
Yeah, I guess my advice for this is to get in community, right? Like I think that when we talk about grassroots, I think one person challenging, it gets tiring and draining, right? And this goes to the last question too. Some of these companies have CDOs, like chief diversity officers, or someone dedicated to holding DEI work or anti-oppression work. And I think that it has to become the job of everybody who works there to uphold that, right? I think the gold standard is like, I say gold standard. One one measure to get to is like, where does this live in our strategic plan? Where does it live in our handbook? Where does it live in my evaluation? So that now I'm evaluating on how am I contributing to the mission around DEI anti-oppression. Until you get there, I think it's about building community around your cause so that you have more voices putting pressure on leadership to listen, right? And
Yep.
so I think building community, keeping the pressure up. I would say I think a lot of these companies, they need to have an outside voice, because there's something about people, there's something, they listen differently sometimes.
Yeah.
I will acknowledge that a lot of companies who have that commitment, or they're starting to listen, their budget doesn't follow. So it's like, I have this commitment, I care about this thing, but it's not reflected in my resources yet. And so for those folks who are in a tough position, there's so many free low cost resources on the internet, right? You mentioned even like affinity groups. Like, how can you get together with folks and educate yourself, look at policies you want to advocate for, look at shifts. And I think in general, be looking at the internal pieces rather than the external. Do not worry about the external. Don't worry about the programming. Worry about your internal culture.
Mhm.
What are the norms that are popping up that are disproportionately impacting folks? What about, look at pay? Like, there are all these metrics that you can look at, and all of that stuff is Googleable.
Yeah.
Before you hire a consultant,
Yeah.
consult Google.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Uh, so you mentioned earlier, there are folks doing the work that maybe aren't getting the attention or community support they need. That could be Stephen, could be Crazy Aunt Lindsay, could be Paige. How do we do a better job of supporting those unsung heroes so that they can feel more supported, part of the community, so they feel at home and prosperous, and not, to your earlier point, like, what are you doing here, kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it makes me think about like what could have kept us.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't have an answer right away. I think some of the surface level answers that come to mind, I don't think are probably possible. Like, I think that um, I think that near the end of my time in Portland, I was doing a lot of surviving. Like, I was extremely tired,
Yep.
I was depressed, and I was tense. And I actually didn't realize that until I got to Atlanta. Like, if you're always in survival mode, you're always like tensing up, like what's gonna happen, who's gonna say something to me, who's gonna like aggress me on the street, in the store, who's gonna try to touch my hair. It's like this, you're always like dodging. And I am not sure how to fix that, because I think about the history of that place, and I think about like how long have Black and brown folks been in like community with white folks, and are we actually in community with each other? And I think about, white folks who have Black and brown partners, or Black and brown folks in their family, and like I think there's some connection and relationship there. But outside of that, the the communities in Portland are pretty segregated.
Yep.
And that is a structural piece, that is a history piece. So I think, off the top of my head, the factors that I listed, it just didn't feel feasible, one, to buy a house there. So the cost of living and the cost of homes in the areas that we wanted to live in, if we wanted to be closer to the city, didn't feel possible. I also think that I just think about the support for Black and brown communities, right? Like it's tiring to be in and building all the time. Like, we were like, who can help take care of us? I'm not saying that never happened. There were certainly folks who were like, we see you, we see the work that you're putting in, we see the effort. But we needed more. Honestly, we needed more. And I, I feel tied to Portland in a lot of ways. And I just think like, man, there's such potential there. And the long-term longevity of folks who are not from there to stay there is a very short window. I think I need to follow back up. I think what's the I'm totally blanking on the name. The group that does the welcome for folks of color.
Okay.
Yes, Say Hey.
Yeah.
I think they
Yeah.
did Partners in Diversity. They did a study, and I need to follow back up on it. Like, when people come and leave, what's the average time? And I think when we left, it was about 3.5 years. And what people were saying is like, we didn't find community. Like,
Yep.
we just didn't. And so yeah, it's tough. It's really tough.
Yeah.
It's hard for me
Yeah.
to answer. That's a
Yep.
great question, though.
Yeah, that's a great answer too. Thank you. Okay, last one. I'm a member of an anti-racist, anti-patriarchy group for people with white and male privilege. We're looking at how we can be accountable and what accountability would mean, for example, to a person or in an organization. What tips or thoughts do you have for accountability for people with privilege?
So I think I understand what this question is asking. What I believe is that white folks have work to do within their groups, and I do think that they should be accountable to BIPOC folk. I think it looks different based on different communities, but instead of burdening BIPOC folks with like, hey, can you oversee us? I think that, again, there are free and paid resources that you can use to be accountable, right? Like, when I think about, I'm thinking even back to some of those questions, there are books written on organizational development as it's centered on race,
Mhm.
ethnicity, gender, age, class. There are folks who've done online courses, right? Like there are people who have said, I'm putting out my scholarship, I'm putting out my emotional labor to hold people accountable. I would
Mhm.
find those folks, right? So it's I think the flip side of it is like, and this was another experience in Portland that I had, that just because someone is Black or brown or whatever doesn't mean that they are an expert in their own experience, but doesn't mean that they're an expert in the systems and analysis, right? We all don't have that. I didn't have that. I had to learn that. It's actually a skill. It's something that people study and they go to school for and they pay for training. So
Mhm.
I would say, find online or a person who is versed in that kind of accountability, because not only do you like I think it's great that you're doing work within your own affinity group, and I think that there needs to be some BIPOC accountability.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that that is just the kind of ultimate example of that, exercising that privilege, where it's like, well, I don't want to spend the time figuring this out, so why don't you just tell me? Because right? And you see so much of that, where I really appreciate your continuing to come back to, like, you can do the research, it's out there.
I
There
promise.
plenty of words have been written about this. You can find
So
them.
many, so many. You can literally Google your question, right? And that, I think that's the thing. Like you said, it's a function of privilege.
Mhm.
We will do it for anything else. Like we freaking put people on the moon. Well, allegedly. Like, okay, we can get into conspiracy theories around that too. But you know what I'm saying? It's like
Yeah.
you Google like how to make a freaking sourdough starter. Like Google some things about race and racism and how to be accountable and where do we start? Like there are people have like volumes of books dedicated to this. And I know it's not a substitute for like in person, like going back and forth and having conversations, but that also takes time and money. Like I think that labor should be paid, right? That labor should be
Yes.
resourced.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not going to let the irony of you just use an example of white bread to talk about white bread stuff. Like, I'm not letting it go.
That was a Friday bonus. That was a bonus. That was a bonus for you, Rick.
Okay. It is Friday evening. It's later in Atlanta than it is here. And I really appreciate Stephanie taking the time to chat with us, but I don't want to take advantage of that time. Stephanie, just to turn it around right now, we have a community of folks here who have attended the event and are wanting to be helpful. How can we as a community help you right now? That could be it could be as simple as, subscribe to my podcast. It could be, I've been thinking about this thing. What can we be doing to help Stephanie Ghoston Paul right now?
Thank you, Rick. I really appreciate that. You can find me on social media. I'm at Cultivated Sense. So it's CULTIVATED Sense, SENSE. On Facebook, on Twitter. Rick regularly retweets me, and I had a really funny tweet. I actually didn't think it was that funny. I tweeted like I write my rudest emails in the morning, and it kind of took off. People really, really enjoyed that. And Instagram. And I would say, please support the podcast. So check out Take Out Nothing When I Die. It's on all major platforms, housed on Anchor, and I have a link on my site too if you just go to my site. And as part of the what I started when I started the podcast was also a Patreon page. So if you're looking to support any of my work, you can donate at various levels there. And I also have donation links on my site. But yeah, it's Take Nothing When I Die, all spelled out on Instagram. And then on Twitter, it's TNWID, just the first letter of each word.
Awesome. Well, Stephanie, thank you. It's so good to see you and good to spend time with you, and always just really appreciate your thoughtfulness and intention and insights about doing this work. And I know the audience appreciates it as well. So